Good afternoon, everyone. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe. My name is Randy Bell, and I'm the director of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. It's good to be back here at Innovation Stream after a couple of weeks away. Thank you all for joining us at EnergySource Innovation Stream, where we aim to highlight new energy technologies with the potential to reshape the global energy system. Today, we will be hearing from Robert M. Lee, Chief Executive Officer at Dragos. Before we get started, two quick administrative details. First, you can follow us on Twitter at AC Global Energy and use the hashtag InnovationStream. Second, after Rob's presentation, you can submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, and I will try to get to as many of these questions as I can. If you're watching on another platform like YouTube, unfortunately, we can't take your questions. So please let me welcome Rob to the Atlantic Council. Rob, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.
How are you doing, and how is Dragos doing during the pandemic? How is working from home treating you?
It's good. And so obviously it's taxing on everybody. And I don't want to make light of the situation at all. But one of the things that the pandemic did for a lot of our prospects and customers was highlight the necessity around industrial security and industrial monitoring. And so understanding what's in that environment and how to detect threats became pretty hypercritical, especially as sites around the world went and did remote operations. So while, again, I don't want to make light of the situation, there's a lot of companies that are struggling and people are struggling. It's terrible. For us, we've actually never seen as much interest and inbound as we have through this. So we're doing pretty well.
That's fascinating, and congratulations. And we will right now learn about why companies are interested in your work. So why don't you share your screen? We can get started with the presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much. Perfect. And I want to take this a little bit different as well. And it's always nice to be able to talk about our company and what we do. But what I'm hoping to impart to the audience is much more about the topic in general and really around industrial security and what to be mindful of. So I'll give a quick introduction to Dragos, but actually most of the content is going to be focused on hopefully some lessons learned for folks, and especially for those of you in policy circles. So Dragos as a company, we're a cybersecurity player focused on industrial networks. So your industrial control systems, operations technology, ICS, OT, IIoT, like the industrial Internet of Things, basically the plants, manufacturing sites, transmission, generation power, and similar. We're a company that does technology, services, and intel. So a lot of our insights are generated from our intelligence team going out, learning about the threats and informing our customers. A lot of our partnering with customers is around our services teams, everything from incident response to red teaming and architecture reviews and similar. But of course, the heart of everything for us is our technology, which is focused around industrial network monitoring. So giving folks visibility into those networks, what are their assets, how are they communicating, what's in their networks, then using our detections and analytics to detect threats and helping people respond to those with step-by-step playbooks. So by and large, the themes of visibility and detection and response. And I think that's interesting for our industrial community and definitely policymakers as well, where historically, when we've thought of industrial, we've thought of, there we go. When we thought of industrial, we've thought of power, we've thought of power grids, maybe we start talking oil and gas infrastructure, but everything is industrial. And when we look at our community, it's everything from building automation systems of the data centers that are operating in the cloud to Amtrak when you get up and go in the morning to New York and back and forth here in the Maryland area, to just everything, mining, maritime. It's hard pressed to find a company that doesn't deal with industrial infrastructure and industrial control systems. But when we've looked at the investments into security, whether it be policy or actual resource investments, it's almost exclusively been around the enterprise IT networks. We put a lot of focus on those enterprise networks because we see a lot of threats there. So a lot of enterprise security tends to be high frequency, low impact analysis. We're looking at thousands of phishing emails or scanning or hacking attempts or whatever, but not every one of them is going to bring down your company. So it's not high on the risk, but it's enough to watch. And so our attention gets focused there. And what our community over the last couple of years has really realized is that we all are industrial and our infrastructure is changing. So for some companies, we talk about this in concept of digital transformation. Some talk about it in Industry 4.0. But the reality is we're all talking about hyperconnectivity. So unfortunately, there's still a lot of companies who believe they have an air gap. or there's a lot of executives of those companies that believe they have segmentation and their plants are completely disconnected. The reality is we're all actually pretty connected, if nothing else, to integrators and OEMs and vendors. But the reality is we are moving very quickly to a hyper connected world. It's not coming, it's happening now. And as our systems start changing, we also are getting faced with threats that are not the ones that we're facing in the enterprise. And so this is actually a talking point I have a lot, not only in policymakers, but to executives of these companies, because it's very reasonable for an executive to sit there and go, we've been doing this for 20 to 30 years. Nothing's ever happened. Why all of a sudden is this important? And capturing the why is fairly simple, but you got to do it without the hype, without the FUD that goes around it. Because too often we'll hear like the power grid's going to go down because I got a phishing email. Like, no, it's not. And there's not one grid. But our systems are changing and our threats are different. When we look at industrial threats and what they're doing, it's not just about system level security or data protection. Our environments, you're dealing with physical processes. So I usually tell people it's kind of everything that you might expect in IT networks plus physics. And we really need to understand that physics interaction, that physical interaction is a very important thing. Years ago, I wrote a paper with Michael Asante titled The ICS Cyber Kill Chain. I was looking at the fact that in our world, there's a second stage of things that happen if you're talking about high consequence, kind of high determinability on attacks. If I want to go modify a turbine, if I want to go stop a production line or attack a safety system like happened in 2017, where adversaries explicitly tried to kill people at a petrochemical facility. That's not malware exploits, cool hacking. That's understanding the engineering, understanding the operations, fully understanding that physical environment and going after it. So with that convergence of our landscape changing and the convergence of threats becoming more and more active and understanding industrial operations, it drives a necessity that we haven't simply had in the past. Now, from a Dragos perspective, one of the things that we try to help the community understand is exactly what those threats are and how to deal with them. Again, a lot of what we do is in the technology, but I want to leave this more educational for folks. So I'll focus on the threat piece, which is if we look back to 2011, 2012, or even before, we would be talking as a community at any given point around one threat. So, hey, here's this one attack happening. Here's this one threat. Here's this one campaign happening. And it was a big deal. I remember in 2012 and 2013, we heard the Dragonfly threat. I was like, wow, this campaign is targeting energy systems directly. It's a big deal. But that has definitely sort of sped up in the sense that we're tracking 12 different states that target industrial control system environments directly, consistently. The pace and the volume of what we're dealing with is fundamentally different than even 5 years ago. But so are the lessons learned and the insights, which we must be driving back into our strategies, frameworks, policy, regulation, and even just security strategies. One of the things I like to note, though, is that part of this is just the fact that we're now getting those insights. It's not that the threat showed up out of nowhere. It's that historically we didn't actually go into the industrial networks and industrial control environments and collect data and monitor and try to understand what was in there. And as companies are getting more mature and are doing that, we are seeing more things. So it's an aspect of collection as well. But we also do see the threats getting more aggressive and learning from each other. One of the realities of attacks in this space is that when an actor goes and shows how to manipulate a safety system in a petrochemical environment, not the malware, it's not the exploit, it's not the vulnerability that matters, it's the how, it's that tradecraft, that tactic, technique, or procedure. And once they show that, it's now a blueprint for any other country or adversary to pick that up and be able to copy. So there's a strong proliferation aspect to any single one of these attacks. And from a typical policy statement, you will find states trying to get parity with one another by learning how to go after these industrial operations. Even in the last year, we put out these reports every year, these industry year in review reports about the threats and vulnerabilities. And even in our last year, we had 3 new threats that were specifically going after industrial operations by compromising remote activity and remote access and remote connectivity directly to the plants. And this was pre-COVID and pre-Cisco, F5, everything else, VPN vulnerabilities that come out in the last couple of months. My guidance last year to folks was, hey, you should be being proactive. You should have an incident response plan. You should be monitoring in these industrial environments with industrial focused technology that can understand these communications. But yeah, you're good. Now we see this flurry of vulnerabilities for remote access, and there's plenty of interest in ICS. My guidance has changed a little bit to companies that they ought to assume that they're compromised and they need to go hunting in those networks instead, because there's been plenty of opportunity for adversaries to take advantage of that. And we have more than seen our adversaries sort of eye of Sauron over to these sites, realizing that many of them are doing remote operations now. Kind of in closing, is kind of bringing us all up to speed on what the latest is. When we look at kind of what's happened over just the last couple months, there's three big things that people should be paying attention to. First, those activity groups, as we call them, but think of them as teams or threats that are targeting industrial sites, they continue to be extremely expansive and targeted and aggressive. And what I mean by that is you are not going to see a lot of big attacks in the media. You might only hear about one or two at a time for these industrial companies, but Dragos is the largest ICS instant response firm in the world. We get called into most of these attacks, and I can tell you, we've done a really good job of keeping most of them out of the New York Times and Washington Post and similar. That's not where we want our customers to be. There's other proper ways to do information sharing. So don't let what's in the public space be confusing. There's way more happening than what's getting reported on. And as we see it, all these threats are going cross industry, cross region, and doing pretty expansive operations. The second thing is from a ransomware perspective, which has kind of been an equalizer that every company has to deal with ransomware over the past couple of years. We're seeing more and more ransomware, including industrial programs and protocols and communications inside of their capabilities, where it is very evident that ransomware is getting more and more into OT environments, and the criminals are getting a sort of return on investment in doing that. And this past year, we had what we called Ekans, which was the very first ransomware specifically focused on industrial control system processes, specifically from sort of the operations technology level. So we are expecting to potentially see kind of a trend of that. If this is valuable and if criminals can ransom an entire factory or similar, they might start going in that direction versus just individual ransomware cases. And then lastly, from the vulnerability perspective, too often we over focus on vulnerabilities. A lot of vulnerabilities make sense in IT networks, so that's system level security. But in industrial security, we're talking system of system security. So an individual vulnerability actually doesn't have the same value. And a lot of the functionality we care about in industrial networks, we don't need vulnerabilities to take advantage of. I can turn on the power, I can turn off the power. So the adversaries use a lot of techniques that sort of living on the land, if you will. They're using native functionality. But what I do want to highlight about the vulnerabilities and the ones that can be important is when you have vulnerabilities, especially as it relates to sort of the supply chain aspect, where vendors may not know where all their software is, may not know who all their customers are, or where they've OEM'd certain software into the product lines. That can be a real mess. Ripple 20 is a great example of that. So these Ripple 20 vulnerabilities came out related to software that got OEM'd into hundreds of companies around the world and in tons of product lines, not to downplay the good work of the OEMs, but the OEMs do not know what all products they have that have those vulnerabilities. So if your strategy is, I'm going to put up a firewall and then patch, the problem is patches will never come out for most of the equipment that you have that have these vulnerabilities. And the life cycles of industrial environments are 10, 15, 20 years. So even a class of vulnerability like the Ripple 20 vulnerabilities can be a 20-year long problem for industrial operators. And if we lend on our traditional IT security practices, just copy and paste it into the industrial networks, we're going to miss out. And we're not actually going to reduce the risk like we think. So I usually try to push people towards understand your protection strategy, develop a really good detection strategy, and develop a response strategy. Those three things working together are going to help on that. And of course, as I close out from the Dragos piece, that's where we get involved in our tech and our services to try to help people. But what I would advocate is you can do this. Sure, we like partnering with people, but this isn't an unsolvable challenge. Defense is doable here, and it's worth investing in for the safety of our people and the reliability of our infrastructure.
Rob, thank you so much. That's really fantastic. Really, really interesting. If you can stop sharing your screen, we can go to the Q&A. And I know I have a ton of questions, and questions are starting to pop up in the Q&A function. So remember, everybody in the audience, use the Q&A function to ask questions. First, this is on my mind, is you mentioned that with COVID, there are more and more remote access issues, more and more remote access vulnerabilities. How has that changed the threat landscape from your perspective? But then, sort of on the flip side, as companies are thinking about what the work looks like in the future, having many companies having moved fully remote and seen that be somewhat successful, how do you what do you recommend for them if they're thinking through being much more remote? Do you recommend not doing that, and trying to keep as much sort of in on site as possible, or do you see ways of managing those risks?
Yeah, I see ways of managing those risks. So um, it's not going to be every industry in the same. Like I'm not going to advocate to the nuclear power plant the same thing that I would not advocate to the manufacturer of food and beverage. But on a whole, I would say that digital transformation kind of journey of whatever you want to define it as is happening to companies globally. And they were fighting not only tech and process, but also culture around how to make that happen. And for many, COVID kind of sped that up. Not necessarily the transformation piece where they're getting all the value, but all the risks they were worried about, they inherited. But at the same time, to your point, getting access to more workforce, being able to recruit across the world or across the country that you're in at a given time, and also being able to take advantage of cloud analytics and process optimizations and things that are going to drive value to the company. I don't want security to stand in the way of that. Like the security, too often we get that discussion of, well, I don't want to do it because of security. No, that's silly. We need to focus on the business needs. But as security professionals, we need to understand and be able to advise on what are the better ways to do it to reduce the risk. My recommendation on this topic is that your plants have had the technology to do remote operations. They've historically not done it because of their own concerns. They're doing it now. So now is the time to get in there and have a conversation going, okay, you guys are doing this. Let's talk about the way to make this sustainable. And let's go ahead and help our companies make that transition.
And are you having those conversations with utilities and big manufacturers?
Everybody. It is a massive conversation across the entire community right now. So I regularly get called into like board meetings and similar now over Zoom, which is kind of fun and interesting, specifically on those topics. And kind of, again, not to overdo it, but on the sales side of it, we have never been busier because one of the first things you're going to do is pick a partner. And we have a lot of expertise. We usually get brought into that. And the next thing you're going to do is figure out, well, what is our people, process, and technology mix? But technology is going to be a piece of it. And actually getting visibility into those plants is going to be a pretty critical component of that.
Got it. Okay, one more question for me before I go to the audience. And this, you mentioned that you see a lot more attacks that get publicized in the New York Times, but at the same time, you discussed how sometimes it's hard to get a CEO to actually really care about this issue. They've done something for 25 years. Why change now? Do you think that there might be value in actually getting some more of these attacks publicized at that level in the New York Times so that the CEO reads it and recognizes actually how big a threat it is?
This is a really good question. So I think there probably is, but the balance is so delicate and you can do so much unintentional harm that we opt not to. So I'm not going to stand and be like, that's not a value. And I critique any company who does publicize these things. But from my point of view, the butterfly effect of it can be so damaging that I don't want to do it that way. A good example is if it's something sufficiently scary, you could accidentally prompt regulations that go a completely different direction of what you're trying to solve, or you could have real stock impact on investor-owned companies and similar. What I have found, though, is the infrastructure community, probably more so than any other community, has done a fantastic job of setting up ISACs and relationship with governments and similar, that there are a lot of proper channels to be able to disseminate information. And we have not run into roadblocks there yet to ever have to explore anything else.
Got it. Okay, it's really fascinating, and I'd love to keep in touch with you about negotiating that balance, because
it's a weird one too. Even when you talk about, hey, I'm dealing with an attack that is probably a national security issue. What's the role and responsibility of the government here? But I don't know that the government has actually properly defined that either, and so there's not an easy answer.
Huh. Fascinating. Well, then we have a good follow-on question to what you just said about an attack that might be a national security issue from someone in the audience named Alfredo, who asks, you mentioned 12 states are targeting ICS infrastructure, but you only mentioned 11 adversary groups in your slides.
Yeah.
So can you explain what that means, and if maybe talk about who those 12 states are?
Yeah, so 12 state groups, but not necessarily 12 independent states. So I'm not saying that it's like China, Iran, and like 11 other or 10 others, but there are 12 state actors. And right now, what we're seeing in terms of ICS specific targeting is exclusively the sort of domain of state actors. I don't think it will always be, but it is currently. But the reason I show 11 is because there's 11 that are public. But I'm not going to lie to the audience and say there's only 11. There are 12, but there's a newer one that we found that we're now going through the proper disclosure channels, if you will. And when we think that the community has had ample time to respond to it, then we will make it public as well.
That's fascinating. What are the motivations for these attacks from these state groups?
Super varied. I think people like to put, I don't think it's without merit, and so I'm not critiquing the presenters that do this, but I personally get frustrated when I see oversimplification of intent and motivation of state actors. Nation states care about this and criminals care about that. And that's not accurate. And also they're not nation states, usually they're just state actors. But without the semantics of it, the thing that's important to realize is intent is really hard to nail down. So motivation is one of the most difficult intelligence requirements to truly understand. But there's a wide variety of them. Good example. The classic one is state actors positioning an infrastructure for potential wartime scenarios, being able to have the capability to use later. Okay, that one's easy to understand, but would it make sense for a state actor to do a small attack, like a 30-minute electric outage on distribution system? Probably not from a wartime scenario, but if you're trying to erode confidence in voters ahead of the election, that actually might make a lot of sense to do. And it's below any threshold where states might actually respond to each other, because we've already had cases that have set a little bit of precedence in like Ukraine 2015, Ukraine 2016. We've had larger electric outages due to cyber attacks and nobody did anything about it. In the same way, you can also get into a lot of intellectual property theft, especially when you're talking manufacturing. Your recipes and IP is in the manufacturing lines, not in your enterprise networks. And you can also get into competitive scenarios where a state-owned infrastructure company or state-owned manufacturer may want to do a hostile takeover of another company or of a JV, and being able to do a cyber attack that also becomes public that dips their stock price even temporarily can be a very interesting motive. So there's tons of reasons to do it, and I guess my answer would just be that they become far more nuanced than I think the community often gives them credit for.
Really, really, really interesting. Okay, we've got a great question from Dakota Carey that is going to challenge you, I think, a little bit.
I've read it. It's good. It's a good question.
Oh, good. Okay, well, I'll read it for everybody else. A couple of companies that operate in the OT security space have advertised using machine learning to do anomaly detection for security. What's your opinion of this technique? Dragos has commissioned a 451 research paper that argued against the technique in 2019. Do you stand by that critique of deployment of machine learning?
Yeah. What we said was not that machine learning is stupid or bad or similar. It's largely misapplied on this topic. And a lot of companies tout machine learning or artificial intelligence as their solution and as the answer. And it's honestly a pretty, I think, silly thing to do because you're doing something really important, but it's not. Machine learning makes it magic. We've allowed machine learning and artificial intelligence to become pixie dust to otherwise explain what you're actually doing. My view is in the enterprise networks where we've built up this foundation of signature matching, of looking for threats and behaviors and everything else. On top of all that, machine learning can add value. You can look at prioritization use cases. Okay, across all the things I'm looking at, what are some of the things that are standing out as anomalies on top of this stack? But as I go into an industrial network that's never had anything done in it before, why am I trying to randomly alert on every anomaly instead of looking for the things that I actually care about? So I would actually tell folks instead, first focus your detection strategy on identifying malicious behaviors. Look for the behaviors or TTPs, or sometimes we even look at like MITRE ATT&CK for ICS discussions of that. What are the things we know to look for that are bad? Let's start there. After you get through that, feel free to go and use innovative ways and try to come up with other things. But don't get hung on, it's machine learning, it's going to generate value. What we find with most companies who use those competitive products that use machine learning as their mechanism is that they're actually tuning it on your own environment. There's no magic training data set of our ICS threats. And so all you're doing is change detection. and you're getting hundreds of thousands of alerts a day, and you're just going to drown in that. And most people just click next, next, all right, whitelist this out, whitelist this out. But the adversaries that are really targeting industrial environments are using native functionality. So the flow that you whitelisted out and said, well, that's okay, tomorrow could be abused in an absolutely malicious way, and you'll just be blind to it. So it's not machine learning's bad. I don't think you lead a detection strategy with machine learning. I think machine learning has capabilities to enhance detection strategies after you've established them.
Something you said is a really raises a question that Vinay Sharma asks, which are how much manpower do these cyber security solutions require? And it sounds like with this machine learning, you actually need people to be going through and looking at each of the anomalies that are detected, which you think of artificial intelligence as something that reduces the need for people doing jobs, but this actually sounds like it creates a lot of work.
Yeah, it can. And so without trying to do a one size fit all, but it absolutely can. If you are doing a highly repeatable or definable task, machine learning and artificial intelligence can be fantastic. And it can turn into a lot of automation to reduce manpower in similar jobs. But in cybersecurity, you're dealing with adversarial data and adversarial injects. And so it's not the same thing over and over again. And you're not training on it. It's going to be different. And so there's a lot of human analysis that goes into it. And if you over rely on machine learning, what you end up getting is a lot of noise that then you need a lot of people. And so if you're going to lead your detection strategy with machine learning, I would advocate for hiring more people so that you can also have data scientists to churn through the data to try to find the nuggets of goodness that you need. That's also where I want to focus people on. Start with what we know bad looks like, not in terms of indicators like IP address and stuff, but bad behaviors that we can focus on that are expansive and catch a lot of adversaries. And what you're honestly doing is reducing the alarms that we're putting in front of people so that you need less people to go after this. But to the heart of the question, do you need dedicated ICS cybersecurity professionals? Yes. Do I think you need to build a second security operations center and a whole new structure and all that? No. A couple empowered people in your organization who understand your industrial operations can be real change agents inside of that company.
Got it. That makes a lot of that's really interesting. It makes a lot of sense. Okay, I want to ask one final question, a sort of bigger picture. You were just named to the Department of Energy's Electricity Advisory Committee.
Mhm.
Where do you see the best opportunities for the DOE and the private sector to work together in addressing the risks to the electricity sector and other parts of operational technology that touch the energy system?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Department of Energy has done a fantastic job over the years of really developing that community feel. If you are in the electric sector, you know somebody in the DOE, you have connective tissue with them or somebody in labs, and then they show up to the party, if you will. They actually get involved in the community. It's a by name relationship, which actually the DHS, as an example, has been doing better at in recent years. Or like Chris Krebs, you'll see him out at RSA and DEF CON and whatever else in the InfoSec community. And so being a part of the community is one of the first steps that the government needs to do to earn that trust. After that, it's incredibly important for the Department of Energy, in my opinion, to make sure they see what is working and not working and help amplify that. I'm not looking for government to develop unique solutions. Actually, a lot of the expertise, especially around energy security, is in the private sector. And that's not a competitive thing. It's actually the investments government has made in the years in the community has allowed the community to be better than the government. You want good insights on the threats, if you want good solutions, if you want good expertise, it is better in the private sector than in the government. But the government is fantastic at looking across everything, especially on threats and what could be national security issues, and amplifying the ones that matter. Unfortunately, DOE and government agencies tend to be a little bit handcuffed, though, because where they can try to come out and issue best practices, they quickly get into areas where people start complaining, well, why didn't you mention my product, or why don't you want my approach, or whatever else? And in many ways, the government can even get in trouble for saying X, Y, or Z doesn't work. And so one of my recommendations, largely the Department of Energy, is this isn't a competitive, anti-competitive thing. It's almost more of a safety thing, just in the way that whatever your COVID strategy is, we don't want 50 different ones across the country. Whatever it is, let's figure out an answer and amplify some options that work. In the same way, the DOE can take a more leadership position of, here are some things we see that do work. Let's amplify those so that asset owners and operators can take advantage of what is occurring around the community.
Well, unfortunately, it does seem like we have 50 different COVID strategies around the country. Let's hope our cyber strategy is a little bit better. We are out of time. So thank you, Rob, for joining us today. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And make sure you connect with Rob on LinkedIn and follow him on Twitter at Robert M. Lee. This presentation is going to be available on the Atlanta Council website, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So please share with your colleagues. Special thanks to all those who helped put this event together, including Olga Kokova, who was your fantastic host for the past 2 weeks, Katie Wimsat, Laura Macedo, and Roger Morales. I hope you all join us for the next episode of Innovation Stream with Sherwin Doss, Managing Director at Energy Peace Partners. Now, this will be a slightly different approach to Innovation Stream, as we'll be talking not about a technological innovation, but a financial innovation designed to advance renewables. Sherwin will be discussing Peace Renewable Energy Credits, PRECs, a new financial solution that promotes renewable development in conflict zones. It promises to be a fascinating discussion. And I hope you will join us for other virtual Global Energy Center events in the next few days, including on Monday, July 20th at 10 a.m., we have an event on hydrogen, transatlantic opportunity for a clean energy recovery. On Tuesday, July 21st at 8 a.m. Eastern, a virtual fireside chat with His Excellency Dharmendra Pradhan, Indian Minister of Petroleum, Natural Gas, and Steel. And he'll be talking about COVID-19 and the future of India's oil and gas industry. Now, watch this space. This time might slip back by half an hour, so it might start at 8:30. And then finally, on Wednesday, July 22nd at 11 a.m., we have an event on green stimulus and the energy transition. Information on all these events can be found at the Atlanta Council website. So thank you all again for joining us. Thank you, Rob. We really, really appreciated this conversation. And we look forward to working with you more closely, Rob. And we look forward to seeing everyone in the audience again next week.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.